Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 86th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our discussions twice monthly to demonstrate how open-minded discussions of contentious topics can lead to better understanding and the discovery of common ground. Today, our panel will discuss how and why voting regulations are viewed by some as racially biased, even though they are the same for everyone. Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Charlie Aukerman, a retired journalist and educator. On his left is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher and member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Jerry Ritzman, chairman of the board of Ritzman Pharmacies. We'll begin our discussion this morning with Charlie Aukerman. Charlie, some argue that the photo ID requirement and other voting rules are intended to suppress the minority vote. Others say that the regulations are needed to control voter fraud. What do you think?
I think I lean a little bit more toward the first thing, because widespread voter fraud that they talk about a lot, I have not seen any. I mean, I have seen voter fraud, but it's usually very local, and it doesn't really have a major effect on a major election, for example, a presidential election. Now, the question that I've always had, and in this issue, I've always wondered why they can't. Now, every year they go through the same hassle. You know, why cannot we come up with a set of rules this year that applies to next year's election? But they never do. It's always, all right, we'll now argue over whether we can have early voter thing. Some states, for example, North Carolina, allows same-day registration. Mm-hmm. And what's wrong? It works. It seems to work for them. But in Ohio, we never can come up with any solution. But I do think that there is some logic to the fact that they want that some of the regulations are involved in trying to support voter outcomes and voter elections.
Okay, I don't think that there's any doubt that any time somebody's got political power, they're going to try to switch things to their advantage.
Yes.
But the question I have about voter fraud, every time I would see a report, they're recording voter frauds where people got caught and convicted. But they never talk about those people that got away with it and how it might work out. Do you have a sneaky suspicion that maybe there's a lot of voter fraud that goes on that people just don't know about?
I don't think there's as much as we like to talk about, but I think that there is some voter fraud. Now, you know, one thing that they called voter fraud in Ohio a few years ago was not really voter fraud in the sense that people were voting as they should, but they couldn't get to the lines.
That part I've never understood.
Remember that? You know, it happened at Kenyon College. That's why I remember it mostly. The lines got so big down in Gambier in that area that people didn't get to vote. Now, if you didn't get to vote, I don't know what you call that. You know, if your voting polls close at 8 o'clock and you don't quite get there.
Well, it means not enough polling places or something. Yeah. Patty, you've had a lot of experience in working in polling places. How does that happen? I mean, people standing in line for 2.5 hours to vote, that's a dedicated citizen.
Right, and that's really, I don't see that happening.
Yeah.
It depends. You have to understand, first of all, that each state sets up their own voting laws.
Yes.
So it is not, it's not national laws that we have. So that's why you have all the differences. And then within each county, like we work with the Medina County Board of Elections. They, agree with their schedule and everything else, and their schedule for voting may be different from another county within the state, but they have to get permission for that. As far as voter fraud is concerned, I really think that this is a myth that has been blown out of, not to say that there hasn't been any, but it's a myth that's been blown out of proportion by the Republican Party. I found a report from PolitiFact that in Texas between 2002 and 2015, they found 85 documented cases of voter fraud over 13 years. May seem like a lot, but there were 42 million ballots cast during that time, which works out to be 2/1000 of a percent of the voting population. This is not going to sway elections. And there are examples like that. You know, they say that it's actually, there's more reported cases of UFO sightings than there are of voter fraud, which, you know, kind of puts it into perspective. You also have cases where, in Florida, where they erroneously purged 12,000 names from the rolls in 2000. 44% were African American. 44% of the population wasn't African American, but it seems to be a much higher percentage. At the present time, it's reported that there is a preponderance of purging names from the ballots. And it is a conservative-led issue in Republican states, and they're trying to remove names, in many cases, that sound ethnic. So if there's a John Smith in this county that's registered and a John Smith in this county that's registered, although that's a common name, they just purge them both without checking to see if that's two different people. So, and there have been there's a concern that people will go to the polls and find out that they're not registered because their name has been purged. You know, the courts have ruled, and in numerous state cases, that the voter ID laws are set up, in fact, to suppress minority votes. In 2012, in Kansas and Tennessee, the Government Accountability Office stated that their ID laws reduced minority votes by 2%, which was 122,000 votes. And it was due to suppression of the votes. Now,
excuse me, how does that happen? Why does an ID requirement suppress minority votes?
well, when you have, it depends on the ID. When you have a photo ID, there are fewer members of the African American community, fewer poorer people that purchase or have a voter ID because there is a cost involved to it. It's almost like establishing a poll tax. And
all they have to do is to prove their citizenship. How does that get expensive? Don't most states have a free ID?
No, not with the photo ID. I'm talking about the photo ID.
The photo ID, isn't it? Well, it's free in Ohio, isn't it?
Oh, no, you have to buy it.
Oh, you do?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
You can't get an, it's just, the cost for buying a state ID is the same as to buy a driver's license.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I know that for a fact because I got one for my mother a couple of years before she passed. So I do know there's a cost, and you do have to show a copy of the birth certificate and those things to get that photo ID.
You have to do the same thing to get Social Security, food
right,
stamps.
although a Social Security card is not something that's considered a valid ID.
No, but you have to
polls.
be able to prove your citizenship in order to get
Which is done with
Social
the
Security
copy
card.
of your birth certificate.
So you've got the proof of your citizenship.
But once you have that, they're not accepting that. If they say it has to be a photo ID, then that means you have to take the extra step of paying for and purchasing that. And I mean, I think it was in Pennsylvania, the one legislator stated that they wanted to put in the photo ID simply to sway the vote because they knew the people in the electorate that would be affected.
So they
by
found a
that.
politician who accidentally told the truth.
Exactly. But that's happened in other cases and in other states where they have determined that. In 2011, a Republican lobbyist in Wisconsin said that was the reason they were doing the ID laws the way they were was so that if it was a close election, there would definitely be a recount because they could claim there was voter fraud. So it's this big myth that if it's said often enough, people feel that it's automatically true. And, I don't necessarily think, and the other thing is too, because the big thing now they're saying for this is the photo ID. That's what you have to do.
Yeah.
But they're not addressing, duplicate voting, absentee voting, which, I'm just off the top of my head. I would guess that's probably the easiest way to do voter fraud if you wanted to. Or
you don't need a photo ID to do absentee voting, do you?
No. Well, not in Ohio, but you don't. I don't know how that works in other states. The thing with an absentee ballot, a legitimate voter could request one. It comes to their house. Anybody in that house could pick up that ballot, fill it out, and send it back in.
Yeah.
So I think there's a greater chance, if there's going to be fraud,
Yeah.
that would be the place where you're going to see that.
Yeah.
As you know, I know there's a big push right now to have observers in the polling booths.
Well, they are there, aren't they?
Not always. Very seldom do you see observers. Most people think you can just show up and observe. No, you can't. It's not.
Okay.
You do have to be. You can be appointed by the political party, or there's a way to be elected in, and then you have to register with the County Board of Elections.
Yeah. Well, I want to circle around to absentee ballots in a minute, but Jerry, you've been doing some thinking on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. Patty, you mentioned how many votes were disallowed because of the
Florida,
percentage
well, yeah.
Yeah.
because of the photo ID.
Yes.
And what was that stat?
The ones that were purged, or the ones?
No, not to purge, that weren't able to vote because they didn't.
Oh, okay. Sorry, that was in 2012. That was 122,000. It was in
Of
Kansas and Tennessee.
Which voters?
They felt minority voters.
Okay,
And
how
this-
many non-minority voters were denied?
This came from the Government Accountability Office.
You don't know how many?
No, because they did
non-minority-
not have that
okay.
figure.
All right, just wondered there. Okay.
Yeah.
We have all this talk about suppressing the vote. And so I thought, boy, how are we suppressing the vote in Ohio, in Medina County? Just an observation. Maybe there isn't fraud out there. Maybe we only detected those very infinitesimally small percentage of fraud because the regulations we have are preventing it. It also could be that if you're a good fraudster, they're not catching you. So I don't know if there's fraud out there or not, and maybe our regulations are preventing it. So I went to the Medina County Board of Elections. How do you register to vote? You have to have a registration form in to the County Board of Elections 30 days before the election to be able to vote. What do you need? You need to fill out this form, check whether you're a citizen or not, and it says that are you a U.S. citizen? Yes or no. Will you be 18 years of old? Yes or no. You can provide the last 4 digits of your Social Security number, or you can provide the driver's license number, or you can say I don't have either. Okay, and then you just get this.
Can't you also use a utility bill?
That's to vote.
That's to
Oh,
vote.
okay.
When
That's
you
to
go to
vote.
vote, voter ID, you can use an unexpired driver's license, a military ID, a photo ID that was issued by the U.S. government, an original copy of a utility bill with your address on it,
Less than 1 year
a
old.
bank statement, an original copy of a paycheck, original copy, or current other government document. If you do not provide one of the above documents, or your driver's license or ID number, or the last 4 digits of your security number, if you don't have any of that stuff, you can still cast a provisional ballot. You don't need an ID. You don't need a photo ID. You can still vote. They'll verify that you are that person in a provisional ballot, and your ballot will get cast.
Well, you
So-
have to still, if you do that in that case, if you refuse to show ID and you cast a provisional, you have a certain amount of time, and I can't remember exactly, to produce an ID to the Board of Elections. So it's not automatically counted, and eventually you will have to show something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says you have to return within 7 days following the day. So you don't need a photo ID. The voter, you have those, so to register to vote, you can just fill out this form, provide those numbers, and just attest to it. You don't need a photo ID. You can sign, you have to provide your signature.
How does a provisional vote work? At some point you have to,
At some point, you have to prove who you are.
only if the election is close enough that it would matter whether your vote is
I
counted
don't
or
know
not.
what their
No,
procedures
it's,
are.
provisional ballots are we vote, we get a card, we put in the machine and we vote. Regular vote, nobody knows who it is. Provisional ballot, you have to fill out the one side, it has your name, address, all of this sort of thing.
Okay.
You fill out a paper ballot, it goes into that envelope and is sealed. The Board of Elections gets that provisional ballot and then will check to see if you are a legitimate voter. And it takes quite a bit of time in order to do
But
that.
they would do that with every provisional vote, regardless of
Absolutely.
the outcome of the election?
Yes,
I
yes,
see.
absolutely.
Okay.
They're required to do that to make sure that vote counts. Now, if it's because a person refused to show any type of identification, and it doesn't have to be a picture ID, just any the types of identifications
that were mentioned.
you have to provide something within 7 days. Where you run into problems with provisionals a lot of times is simply people moving, and they have moved to a new location, but they did not re-register to vote in that new location.
Is that how some of those thousands of voters get purged? They moved and didn't re-register?
Some do, yeah.
Some do.
I mean,
some do. They do things like they check the death rolls.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when my mother passed, I got a letter in the mail shortly after from the Board of Elections stating that she would no longer be on the voting list because it was under their impression that she was deceased, and if this was incorrect, to contact them. So they follow up on all of that stuff.
Yeah. I tend to get a little bit suspicious anytime. I mean, racism gets tossed around so much that it's almost lost all of its sting. But it's used as an example of in so many cases. I mean,
I don't actually know that I would call it racism. It's odd. It's the fact that many of your ethnic or minority voters tend to vote one way. They tend to vote Democratic.
Yes.
So it is and many of these calls are from the Republicans. In the cases I cited were Republicans doing this. What they're trying to do, it's not that they are opposed to a black person or opposed to a Native American. It's, I don't want the Democrat to win, so we will suppress the voters that we think will vote for that Democrat.
is the reverse true for people who'd like to have Sunday voting? They want, because Democrats would tend to vote on Sunday when Republicans wouldn't?
I don't know, and I haven't really seen that. We do have Sunday voting, early Sunday voting here in Ohio. I think the last 2 Sundays prior to the election, you can vote. It's limited hours.
At this point,
You can go to the Board of Elections website.
Yeah,
and find
Sunday
those
voting
hours.
hours in Medina County are October 30th and November 6th from 1 to 5.
1 to 5. I was thinking 12 to 4. I knew it was like
Yeah.
4-hour
There
window.
are places where it's been eliminated, and the racist accusation is leveled at the boards of election who eliminated Sunday voting. In fact, the NAACP makes quite a big issue out of the fact that black people like to vote on Sundays. One of the reasons is they, for some reason, a whole bunch of folks right after church will all go to the polling place.
Yeah.
And all. So they want to maintain Sunday voting. Is that because they just want to make sure that minority voters have an equal opportunity, or they just want to see more Democrats vote?
I think it's because they want to see more access to the polls.
By whom?
If you
The Democrats?
look, anyone, nationwide, there's many polling places that have been closed down.
Yes.
We saw, what state was it? Was it New Mexico or Arizona where they'd closed all the polling places in the primary? I can't remember which state it was. Huge lines because they closed all these polling places.
in the primary, they had that all the time.
Why did they do that?
Just because the polls would close at 8 o'clock.
Oh, I see.
and-
They didn't shut down the polling.
So they
place.
didn't let anybody vote to work
No,
with their time.
they had limited polling places too. They closed many of the polling places, so you had a increased number of people. And they do that to save money, basically, in the state. We can't afford to keep all of these workers there, and because it is quite expensive to run a polling place. But once you close those down, well, then you have to find another opportunity to vote. So you have the early voting. I believe is it North Carolina's already voting, if I'm not mistaken.
I think
Is
they
it
are.
North Carolina that's already started?
They
this week?
have, North Carolina has an interesting thing. They have the largest voter turnout growth over in the last few years.
Growth.
Of any country. In 2008, they had the biggest in the country.
Wow.
And so and they allow well, what did they call it here? Let me see if I can find what it's called. One-stop voting, which they adopt a version of early, or you can register on the day. It's called election day registration. You can go register and vote.
And we used to be able to do that in Ohio. That week is gone now. There was, and I forget what they called it.
Golden Week. They call it Golden Week.
The Golden Week, where you could register that day and vote. they've moved back when early voting starts. I
Now-
believe it's October 12th it
Now,
starts.
Maine, Minnesota, and Wisconsin have adopted that permanently, and right now, Idaho, Iowa, Montana, New England, New Hampshire, and Wyoming are studying it. But it works for them, you know. But I don't. You know, it's a very complicated thing, and you know what Patty says is correct. They're probably. I wouldn't say it's racism. I don't like the word racism either, and I think we tend to overuse it on everything. But I think there is a Republican Democratic confrontation, shall we say, on the issue that applies in across the whole country, and I don't know. I just think that it's still got to be possible that both sides can sit down and adopt rules in advance that apply. Instead of going through this thing every single year
At the last
and
minute.
changing things at the
Well,
last
you know, they've
minute.
talked about the national ID card. But
Right.
both sides don't
And,
want
and
that.
there's another thing. There's another
Yeah.
thing that I was thinking on the way up here. Can't walk in this school. When I was teaching up here, and when you were teaching up here, you didn't have to have an ID card. You
no.
can't walk in here now without an ID card. I couldn't walk into Akron University without an ID card when I was teaching at Akron University. And more and more, every time I turn around, more and more companies are adopting the idea you have to have an ID card. So what's the problem with the national ID card? You know, identifying people, but nobody does it. You know? I don't see a problem with them showing the voter registration.
You know, I think it's interesting because when you work at the polls, you know, when people talk about fraud and what's going on, though, every effort is made to make sure that there is no fraud.
Right.
You must have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans at that table. If somebody needs help at a machine, I can't go by myself. There has to be a Democrat and a Republican goes with them. If there is a curbside vote where someone that is unable to get out of the car, by the way, you can do that. If you're unable to get yourself into the polling place, the workers can come out to you.
Do they wear roller skates, Patty?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good.
Yes, and carry little trays.
Good.
But they can go out. It has to be a Democrat and Republican. When the materials are driven back to the Board of Elections, you've got to. It can't be 2 separate cars. You've got to have a Democrat and a Republican riding in the same car with those materials. So all of that is part of checks and balances. Plus, like tomorrow, I have to spend 3 hours at the Board of Election going through training.
Is that right?
Yeah, and that's every election they make. And even if there's maybe one small change, they require training. And then I'll get the notice from the state saying I have to do a 2-hour, minimum of 2-hour online course too.
I want to go back quick to voter suppression,
All right.
if I could. When can I vote from the Medina County Board of Elections? Absentee ballots, 28 days prior to the election, you can start counting those. Voting days and hours for the November 8th presidential general election start in-person absentee voting hours at the Board of Elections starting October 12th. I mean, you start October 12th, you can vote, and then election day. So you can mail in absentee ballots, you can go to the Board of Elections and vote starting October 12th. There are plenty of opportunities if you want to vote, And I don't see the suppression thing.
I'll throw this out as an aside. In Summit County Board of Elections, you can vote there early.
Yeah,
They don't have handicap access.
well,
If you're in a wheelchair, you
Really?
can't. That's right.
yeah.
Oh, would they come down like that?
So I don't know.
They could go
you
out.
know,
They could require somebody to come out to their car for them.
Yeah.
There's a nationally known figure, a sports icon out there that says many American voters have not really looked into the issues, and he says a suggested solution: stop encouraging people who don't want to vote because they are uninformed, and that's
That's wrong
Kareem
with you.
Abdul-Jabbar. And
That must be a real good athlete.
well, I don't know, but it was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. That's his opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know
Well-
how many people, or if that's a particular thing to ascribe to or not. But
I was going to ask the question, does anybody ever done a study? Have you ever heard of a study that says that easy access leads to better political leadership?
No.
No, I
know
don't
that.
think it does.
But I will say something about along that line, what he was saying. in the 1970s, when I was still in college, God help us, way back when, there was a big push to increase the number of voters, and there was actually discussions being held about, let us make it mandatory to vote. And the interesting thing to me has always been that if you're in a free democracy, you shouldn't make anything mandatory.
Australia's
So
mandatory,
it's just,
isn't it?
you're right, Australia has mandatory voting. Does it
What do
help
they do?
Australia?
What do they do in Australia if you don't vote?
I think it's a fine.
Yeah, it's a fine, I think. Costa Rica, some of the Central American companies have it. But what's the sense? You know, I don't think it improves anything. It just, okay, it's an American citizen's right to vote, therefore it's his duty to vote, but necessarily not mandatory.
I wanted to add one thing, just for our audience. If you apply for a absentee ballot, it comes in the mail to you. Please do not decide, oh, I think I'll just show up on the polling day and vote. If you do that, you'll have to vote a provisional ballot. You're not going to be able to vote regular, because once you receive that and this is a way to prevent fraud, once you receive that absentee ballot, we don't know at the polls if you have voted or not, if you have mailed it in, because those aren't counted. Do not expect the poll workers to accept it. They can't. Absentee ballots have to be in before the close of the election. And we don't take anything back till after the polls are closed, so your ballot would be late. So
that's your public service announcement.
if you do accept an absentee, make sure you send it in.
Along with excuse me, Charlie, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Patty, the one thing that I don't know much about, Oregon votes everything by mail.
Exactly, and
Now,
it's
how
been
do
like
you
2
prevent-
years.
What do they do to prevent fraud?
God help us when we start doing it online.
Well, I agree, but I'm saying, they do it already. There ought to be some kind of study out there as to how it works.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for an interesting discussion. And I do have a quote this time. I remembered to get a quote. Slavery is but half abolished. Emancipation is but half complete, while millions of free men with votes in their hands are left without education. Robert C. Winthrop. Thank you very much.